Hi there. Tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to an era that often gets romanticized in fairy tales and epic movies. But beneath the shining armor and grand castles, medieval society held a surprisingly brutal core. Imagine, if you will, living in a world where the very air you breathed was often thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and wood smoke, where every meal was a gamble against starvation, and where justice often meant a very public, very painful spectacle. You'd be navigating muddy, narrow streets, trying to avoid stray pigs and the occasional rogue knight, all while knowing that a simple cough could spiral into a fatal illness. Let's just say your modern creature comforts would be utterly alien, and frankly, you probably wouldn't survive a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, tell us where you are and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the question of why medieval society was so brutal. It's a heavy topic, I know, but we'll explore it gently, uncovering the layers of daily life that contributed to an environment that, from our modern perspective, seems incredibly harsh. You see, it wasn't just one thing, but a confluence of factors, a tapestry woven with threads of desperation, fear, and a very different understanding of human worth. Think about it. A world without the rule of law as we know it, without instant communication, without widespread literacy, and with a constant underlying hum of violence. It's almost like trying to explain why your cat insists on knocking things off the counter. There's a logic to it, but it's a very cat logic, not a human one. Similarly, medieval brutality had its own internal logic, often driven by the stark realities of survival. One of the foundational aspects contributing to this brutality was the harshness of their legal systems. Forget nuanced trials, appeals, or comfortable jail cells. Medieval justice was first and foremost about deterrence. Laws were designed to be severe, with punishments not just handed down, but performed as public spectacles. Imagine, for a moment, walking through a town square and seeing a gallows, or perhaps a pillory, not as a historical exhibit, but as a living, breathing part of the community's social fabric. These weren't hidden away. They were front and center, a constant visual reminder of the consequences of straying from the established order. The goal was to instill fear, to make potential wrongdoers think twice, or ideally, 3 times, before committing an offense. It was a bit like a medieval version of those speed cameras ahead signs, but with significantly more dire consequences if you were caught. A common mainstream historical fact from this era is that public executions were commonplace. They weren't just a means to end a life. They were a form of entertainment, a grim theatrical performance for the masses. People would gather, sometimes for hours, to watch the spectacle unfold. This might seem incredibly morbid to us, but for a population with limited forms of entertainment and a deep-seated belief in divine justice, it was a profound event. It reinforced social norms and the power of the ruling class. Now, a quirky tidbit. Did you know that sometimes, after an execution, the body might be left hanging for days, even weeks, as a further deterrent? It was a macabre kind of scarecrow, warning off both human transgressors and perhaps even overly ambitious crows. Imagine the smell. Historians still argue whether the extreme nature of these public punishments was truly effective in reducing crime, or if it simply fostered a society accustomed to, and perhaps desensitized by, violence. Some scholars suggest that while the immediate deterrent was strong, the constant exposure to brutality might have paradoxically normalized it, making violence a more accepted part of daily life rather than something to be universally shunned. It's a bit like continuously watching horror movies. Eventually, you might just get used to the jump scares. So, as you settle in, consider that the very mechanisms designed to bring order might have inadvertently contributed to the disorder. In the medieval mind, building on the idea of those very public, very painful spectacles, it's crucial to understand a key difference between medieval justice and our modern system: the almost complete lack of prisons as places of long-term incarceration. When you picture a medieval dungeon, you're often thinking of a place of torment, yes, but primarily a holding cell. Jails weren't about rehabilitation, or even necessarily about keeping criminals off the streets for extended periods. They were, in essence, waiting rooms. You were held there, perhaps in grim conditions, only until your trial could be arranged, or until your punishment could be meted out. Once a verdict was reached, justice was swift, and often it was final. Imagine the system. A crime is committed. An accusation is made, and you might find yourself tossed into a damp, dark pit beneath the local lord's castle. You'd be there with common thieves, perhaps a suspected witch, and maybe even a stray goat, all awaiting the moment of truth. There was no concept of serving a sentence for 5 years or 10 years. Once a judgment was passed, whether by a local lord, a royal court, or even through the terrifying trial by ordeal, which we'll whisper about later, the consequence was immediate. This could mean a public flogging, a mutilation, losing a hand for theft, for example, or all too often, death. It was a system built on prompt, brutal resolution, not prolonged confinement. It's almost like trying to get a toddler to share a toy. You don't put them in timeout for a week. You just take the toy away right then and there. A mainstream historical fact here is that debtors' prisons did exist. But even these were more about coercing payment than long-term punishment. For a crime, you'd be held until your debts were settled, often by family or friends, or until you simply withered away. It wasn't a punishment for being in debt, but a mechanism to recover the debt. A quirky tidbit, however, is that sometimes prisoners of war or nobles awaiting ransom might be held in surprisingly comfortable conditions. Think of it less as a jail and more as an involuntary, very expensive B&B, complete with guards who were more like reluctant concierges. They weren't being punished. They were assets to be exchanged. Historians still argue whether the perceived efficiency of this immediate justice outweighed the obvious lack of opportunity for true reflection or reform on the part of the accused. Was it truly about justice, or simply about maintaining order through fear and rapid disposal of problems? The debate highlights the stark contrast in legal philosophies between then and now, this rapid turnaround. The absence of prisons as we understand them deeply impacted the fabric of medieval society. It meant that consequences were visible and immediate, leaving little room for ambiguity. If someone committed a crime, the community saw the punishment, often on the very same day or within days. This visual reinforcement was a powerful tool for social control, designed to keep everyone in line. It's quite a departure from our world, where legal processes can drag on for years, with trials, appeals, and lengthy prison sentences often taking place far from public view. In the medieval world, justice was a spectator sport, ensuring that everyone got the message. loud and clear, and often with a very literal bang. Given that medieval justice didn't rely on long-term incarceration, the punishments themselves had to be highly impactful, not just as a deterrent, but as a clear, symbolic message. Imagine a society where every consequence wasn't just about pain, but about communicating a very specific lesson, often echoing the crime itself. This idea of symbolic punishments meant that the penalty wasn't random. It was meticulously crafted to reflect the transgression, serving as a chilling, real-life warning to anyone who witnessed it. It's almost like a very grim, interactive theater performance where the moral of the story is delivered with a thud rather than a polite applause. Let's consider a mainstream historical fact. For a thief, the common punishment might be the loss of a hand. This wasn't merely about disabling them. It was a powerful symbol. The hand that stole was the hand that was taken. Imagine the chilling clarity of that message. Every time someone saw that person, they were reminded of the crime and its direct consequence. For perjurers, those who lied under oath, the tongue might be branded or even cut out. The organ that uttered the falsehood was explicitly targeted. It's a bit like giving a child who keeps drawing on the walls a special scribble, only on paper marker, but with far more permanent and painful implications. This wasn't just about inflicting suffering. It was about indelible public shaming and a physical representation of the transgression. Now, for a quirky tidbit, sometimes these symbolic punishments veered into the truly bizarre. For example, some historical accounts suggest that individuals caught poaching might be forced to wear the antlers of the animal they illegally hunted, or even be paraded through the town wearing a dead animal, amplifying their shame and connecting them directly to their illicit act. It's like being forced to wear a sign that says, "I stole a cookie," but instead of a sign, it's the actual cookie glued to your forehead. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of these deeply symbolic and often humiliating punishments was more effective than the physical pain in maintaining social order. Did seeing a branded tongue truly prevent others from lying, or did it simply create a deeper undercurrent of fear and resentment? It's a fascinating, if grim, question about human nature under duress. The philosophy behind these punishments was deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset. There was a strong belief in divine justice, that God would ultimately judge the wicked, and earthly punishments were seen as a reflection of, or even a precursor to, that divine reckoning. If you committed a crime, you weren't just breaking a law, you were offending God and the established social order. Therefore, the punishment had to be visible, memorable, and unequivocally clear in its message. It was a constant reminder that society was watching, and any deviation from its rigid norms would be met with an equally rigid and often brutal response. This pervasive fear of public humiliation and physical mutilation acted as a heavy hand, pressing down on the individual, shaping behavior in ways that our modern, more private systems of justice can hardly replicate. Beyond the grim theater of public punishments, another pervasive and deeply ingrained aspect contributing to medieval brutality was the sheer omnipresence of warfare. This wasn't just a sporadic event, a distant conflict seen on the news. No. For many, warfare was a constant companion, a hum beneath the surface of daily life, ready to erupt into devastating reality at any moment. You couldn't just tune it out or scroll past it. Imagine living in a time where the nearest lord might decide to settle a dispute with his neighbor not through polite negotiation, but by gathering his knights and marching into their fields, burning crops, seizing livestock, and, well, engaging in what amounted to a very bloody argument. A mainstream historical fact is that battles were often fought at terrifyingly close quarters. Forget the long-range artillery or precision strikes of modern combat. Medieval warfare was a messy, visceral affair, fought hand-to-hand with swords, axes, and spears. You would be staring into the eyes of your opponent, feeling the jarring impact of blows, smelling the sweat and fear, and hearing the screams of the wounded. There was little concept of clean warfare. Casualties were high, and even if you survived the initial clash, your chances of succumbing to infected wounds, disease, or simply exposure in the aftermath were significantly increased. It's like trying to win a piting contest when everyone else is armed with their own pie. It gets very, very messy very quickly. Now, a quirky tidbit. Did you know that during some sieges, commanders would catapult diseased corpses or animal carcasses over enemy walls? This wasn't just grossed-out humor. It was an early form of biological warfare, aiming to spread illness and demoralize the defenders. Imagine trying to hold a castle while decomposing cows rain down upon you. Definitely not on the tourist brochure. For medieval living, historians still argue whether the concept of just war, a conflict deemed morally acceptable, often by the Church, truly mitigated the brutality of these frequent conflicts, or if it simply provided a convenient moral justification for actions that were often driven by greed, power, and personal vendettas. Was it truly about divine will, or just a good excuse for a rumble? This constant state of potential conflict deeply shaped medieval society. It meant that self-defense, or the defense of your lord and lands, was not an abstract concept, but a very real and present necessity. Towns were walled, castles dotted the landscape, and every able-bodied man, from peasant to noble, had some understanding of arms. It fostered a culture where physical prowess and military skill were highly valued, and where violence, while perhaps regrettable, was an accepted, even expected, tool for resolving disputes and asserting power. It makes our modern squabbles over whose turn it is to do the dishes seem positively quaint by comparison. The pervasive threat of war was a chilling reminder that peace was a fragile commodity, and brutality was often the currency of survival. Flowing directly from the constant threat of open warfare, you also had a particularly medieval phenomenon that added layers to the brutality: private wars and feuds. This wasn't necessarily grand armies clashing, but rather localized, often intensely personal conflicts between powerful individuals, primarily knights. These weren't just petty squabbles. They were often brutal, small-scale campaigns waged to avenge perceived slights, uphold family honor, or simply expand influence. Imagine your next-door neighbor, instead of complaining about your hedge, gathering his cousins and setting fire to your shed. That's the kind of vibe we're going for. Just with more chainmail and fewer sheds, usually. A mainstream historical fact is that in many parts of medieval Europe, particularly during periods of weak central authority, private warfare was not just tolerated, but was an expected part of noble life. Knights, bound by codes of honor and personal loyalty, felt compelled to respond to insults or challenges with force. This often meant raiding in enemies' lands, capturing their vassals, or even directly attacking their castles. The goal wasn't always conquest, but often humiliation and the imposition of their will. It created a patchwork of localized violence, making travel dangerous and agriculture uncertain, as your fields could become a battlefield at any moment. It's like a particularly aggressive game of Risk constantly being played out across the countryside, but with real lives at stake. Now, for a quirky tidbit, Some medieval charters and laws actually attempted to regulate private wars, not ban them entirely. They would set rules about when and how these feuds could be conducted, trying to contain the bloodshed. For instance, the Truce of God movements, often initiated by the Church, sought to limit fighting to certain days of the week or during religious festivals. Imagine being told, you can only burn your enemy's village on Tuesdays and Fridays, please. Historians still argue whether these attempts at regulation were genuinely effective in reducing violence, or if they simply legitimized a form of brutality that rulers were powerless to stop. Did these truces truly bring peace, or just slightly less frequent chaos? It's a debate that highlights the constant tension between aspiration and reality in the Middle Ages. These private wars fostered a deeply ingrained culture of immediate retribution. If you or your lord were wronged, waiting for official justice might be futile or too slow. Instead, the expectation was that you would take matters into your own hands, or, more accurately, your own sword-wielding hand. This emphasis on self-help and violent resolution further normalized brutality, making it a common response to conflict rather than a last resort. It meant that even when there wasn't a grand war on, the countryside could still be a dangerous place, dotted with skirmishes and reprisals, all contributing to the underlying harshness of medieval existence. Beyond the nightly feuds and the grand armies, another significant contributor to the brutal reality of medieval life was the sheer ruthlessness with which rebellions and social unrest were suppressed. If you were a peasant, a commoner, or anyone outside the landed gentry, and you dared to challenge the established order, the response you faced was often swift, merciless, and designed to crush any future dissent. Imagine for a moment a group of villagers, perhaps fed up with exorbitant taxes or an oppressive lord, deciding to rise up. Their noble aspirations would, more often than not, be met with unbridled force. It's like trying to put out a small campfire with a tsunami. The overkill was intentional and absolute. A mainstream historical fact is that many peasant revolts, like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, or the Jacquerie in France in 1358, despite initial successes, were ultimately put down with extreme violence. Leaders were executed, often publicly and gruesomely, and the participants scattered, hunted down, or forced back into even harsher conditions. The message was clear: challenge authority at your peril. These weren't just skirmishes, they were often massacres, designed to reassert the power hierarchy with chilling finality. The ruling classes understood that the foundation of their power lay in maintaining absolute control, and any crack in that foundation had to be sealed with blood and fear. Now, for a quirky tidbit, sometimes, after a particularly brutal suppression, the victorious lords would parade the heads of the rebel leaders on pikes through the countryside, or even place them on London Bridge as a gruesome warning. Imagine trying to explain that to your kids on a Sunday stroll. It was a potent, visceral reminder of the price of defiance. Historians still argue whether the extreme cruelty used to quash these rebellions was a sign of the ruling class's inherent sadism, or a calculated, albeit horrific, necessity to maintain a fragile social order in a period without effective state policing. Was it pure evil, or just stark pragmatism? It's a debate that forces us to confront the difficult choices made in desperate times. This brutal suppression wasn't just about the immediate violence. It had a chilling, long-term effect on the populace. It instilled a deep-seated fear of authority and reinforced the idea that social mobility if it existed at all, was a dangerous climb. It meant that, for the vast majority of people, their lot in life was largely fixed, and attempting to change it through collective action was an almost suicidal endeavor. The constant threat of state-sanctioned violence hung over every village and every marketplace, shaping interactions and limiting aspirations. So, while we might admire the courage of those who dared to rebel, we must also acknowledge the brutal efficiency with which their hopes were often extinguished, a grim testament to the harsh realities of medieval power dynamics. Now, let's turn our attention from the grand, brutal acts of war and suppression to the grinding, relentless harshness of peasant life. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, estimates suggest anywhere from 85% to 90% of the population. Daily existence was an unceasing cycle of back-breaking labor. You weren't just working, you were toiling from dawn till dusk, often 6 days a week, just to put food on the table and fulfill your obligations to the local lord. Imagine waking up before the sun, feeling the chill dampness of your small, smoky hut, knowing that your day involves hours of ploughing fields with oxen, harvesting crops by hand, or tending to livestock, all without the aid of modern machinery. It's enough to make your yoga instructor's core workouts seem like a leisurely stroll. A mainstream historical fact is that the primary occupation for most peasants was agriculture, and their lives were intrinsically tied to the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant weeding and tending. Autumn brought the intense labor of harvest, and winter was a struggle for survival and maintenance. Every aspect of their existence was dictated by the land and the weather. There were no weekends off, no paid vacations. Your holiday might be a religious feast day, and even then, there were often chores that couldn't wait. Your entire family, from young children to the elderly, would be involved in this relentless grind. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that many peasants would often sleep with their livestock in the same hut, especially during harsh winters? This wasn't because they loved the smell of wet sheep. It was for warmth. The body heat from the animals was a vital, if somewhat aromatic, source of heating in dwellings that often lacked chimneys and proper insulation. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism of medieval peasants was a genuine reflection of their inner resilience, or simply a necessary adaptation to a life of perpetual hardship where complaining served little purpose and might even invite trouble. Was it grit or grim acceptance? It's a question that makes you appreciate your central heating just a little bit more. This constant, physically demanding labor left little room for leisure, education, or personal development. Your body was a tool, and its strength was your primary asset. Injuries could be catastrophic. Illness often meant a swift end to your ability to work. And old age was a luxury few lived long enough to experience in comfort. The sheer physical toll of daily life contributed significantly to the overall brutality of the era. It wasn't just about violent encounters. It was about the slow, steady erosion of the body and spirit under the weight of unrelenting toil. A silent brutality that shaped every waking moment. Hand in hand with the relentless labor of peasant life came the equally harsh reality of a limited diet and subsistence living. Imagine for a moment that every single calorie you consumed had to be earned through arduous physical effort, and the variety on your plate was, well, incredibly limited. For the vast majority of medieval people, their daily meals were a monotonous cycle of grains, primarily bread and gruel, supplemented by whatever meager vegetables they could grow or forage. This wasn't about dietary choices or health fads. It was about sheer survival. You certainly weren't going to find any artisanal avocado toast or triple shot lattes. A mainstream historical fact is that cereals like wheat, rye, and barley formed the cornerstone of the medieval diet. Bread was so fundamental that it was often seen as almost sacred. You'd eat it with almost every meal, and its quality, or lack thereof, directly reflected the harvests. If the harvest was poor, the bread was coarser, harder to digest, and less nutritious. Meat was a rare luxury for most, typically reserved for feast days, or what could be hunted illegally at great risk. Imagine going weeks, even months, without seeing a single piece of meat, relying instead on watery stews and rough bread. It's like living on a permanent, very unfun, carb-heavy diet, with no cheat days. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that medieval peasants often drank a weak, fermented ale or cider throughout the day, even children? This wasn't because they were constantly trying to get tipsy. It was often safer than drinking the local water, which could be contaminated. The fermentation process killed many of the harmful bacteria. So, while it sounds like a party, it was more a pragmatic choice for hydration and probably very low in alcohol. Historians still argue whether the chronic low-level malnutrition experienced by most medieval peasants significantly impacted their cognitive abilities and overall energy levels. Was their resilience a triumph of spirit, or simply a byproduct of never having enough truly good food to fuel their brains properly? It's a somber thought when you consider your own daily snack cravings, this constant struggle against hunger, and the reliance on such a narrow range of foodstuffs contributed to a subtle, yet pervasive, form of brutality. Malnutrition led to weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to disease. It stunted growth, reduced life expectancy, and sapped energy levels, making the already arduous labor even more draining. There was no concept of a balanced diet or vitamins. You ate what you could get when you could get it, and hoped it was enough to keep you going another day. The persistent gnaw of hunger and the ever-present threat of famine were silent, yet incredibly powerful, forces shaping the grim reality of medieval life. As we delve deeper into the layers of medieval brutality, it's impossible to overlook the deeply ingrained and often restrictive roles imposed upon women, leading to their largely subordinate position in society. Imagine living in a world where your gender determined almost every aspect of your life, from your legal rights to your economic opportunities, and where your voice was often muted, regardless of your social standing. This wasn't just about polite deference, it was a systemic subjugation that permeated homes, courts, and even the church. It's like being perpetually cast in a supporting role in your own life's play, with very few lines and even fewer chances to direct. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval women, across nearly all social classes, had significantly fewer legal rights than men. They generally couldn't own property independently unless they were a wealthy widow or an abbess, initiate lawsuits, or represent themselves in court. Their legal identity was often subsumed under that of their father, husband, or male guardian. Marriage was less about romantic love and more about economic alliances, dowries, and producing heirs, particularly for noble families. For peasant women, their lives were a relentless cycle of domestic duties, childbearing, and arduous agricultural labor alongside men, often with even less recognition. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that despite these limitations, some women found indirect ways to exert influence? Noblewomen, for instance, sometimes managed large estates in their husband's absence, during crusades or wars, demonstrating significant administrative prowess. And in certain guilds, women could practice trades, especially those related to textiles, brewing, or food preparation. It wasn't full equality, but it shows pockets of agency. Historians still argue whether the concept of courtly love, so prevalent in medieval literature, genuinely elevated the status of women in the eyes of men, or if it merely served as a romanticized ideal that bore little resemblance to the harsh realities of their daily lives. Was it a step forward for women, or just a pretty distraction? It's a debate that highlights the chasm between poetic ideal and lived experience, that this systemic subordination contributed to medieval brutality in subtle but significant ways. It meant that women were often vulnerable to abuse with little legal recourse. Their bodies were frequently viewed as instruments for procreation or property to be controlled. The constant pressure to bear children, often in unsanitary conditions and without medical support, led to high maternal mortality rates. Furthermore, the limited opportunities for education and independent economic activity trapped many women in cycles of dependency and hardship. While not always a direct act of violence, this institutionalized inequality was a pervasive form of societal harshness, shaping the lives of half the population in profoundly restrictive ways. Just as the roles of women constrained lives, another colossal force of medieval brutality, one that swept across continents with terrifying speed, was the shadow of disease outbreaks, most notably the infamous Black Death. Imagine waking up one morning to news that a mysterious, agonizing illness is spreading through your village, turning healthy neighbors into fevered, buba-covered corpses within days. This wasn't a distant threat. It was an invisible enemy that could decimate entire communities, leaving behind a chilling silence and a profound psychological toll. It's like a superflu, but with much less appealing symptoms and a near 100% chance of an unfun ending. A mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death, which peaked in Europe between 1347 and 1351, was a devastating pandemic of bubonic plague. It's estimated to have killed between 30% and 50% of Europe's population, and possibly even more in some regions. This wasn't just a high mortality rate. It was a demographic catastrophe that fundamentally reshaped society. Fields lay fallow, trades ceased, and social structures buckled under the immense strain. Imagine half the people you know gone. The sheer scale of death was incomprehensible, leaving survivors reeling with grief, fear, and a strange new sense of opportunity as labor became scarce. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that during the Black Death, some doctors wore bird-like masks with long beaks filled with aromatic herbs? They believed these herbs would purify the air and protect them from the bad air miasma they thought caused the plague. It looked incredibly bizarre, like a medieval rave costume gone terribly wrong, but it was their best attempt at protection. Historians still argue whether the Black Death, despite its immediate horrors, ultimately led to significant improvements in the lives of the surviving peasantry by increasing the value of their labor and weakening the feudal system. Was it a pure disaster or a brutal catalyst for social change? It's a debate that pits immense suffering against long-term societal evolution. The psychological impact of such widespread death was immense. You lived with a constant awareness of your own mortality and the fragility of life. Faith was both a comfort and a challenge. Why would God allow such suffering? Superstition flourished as people desperately sought explanations and remedies. The breakdown of social norms was common, with some abandoning the sick. while others dedicated themselves to charity, highlighting the paradox of cruelty and kindness that we'll touch on later. The Black Death wasn't just a brutal biological event, it was a profound trauma that left an indelible mark on the collective medieval psyche, reminding everyone that life was short, unpredictable, and often painfully harsh. Just as the shadow of plague loomed large, another relentless and equally brutal force shaping medieval existence was the constant spectre of famine, a recurring nightmare. Imagine living in a time when your survival hinged almost entirely on the unpredictable whims of nature, a late spring frost, a summer drought, or too much rain at harvest time could spell disaster, not just for a few farms, but for entire regions. This wasn't just about tightened belts. It was about widespread starvation, a slow, agonizing death that touched every layer of society, though most brutally, the peasantry. It's like playing a game of Russian roulette with your dinner plate every year, with very real, very grim consequences. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval Europe experienced numerous widespread famines. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, devastated vast swathes of the continent, causing millions of deaths. This wasn't due to a lack of effort on the part of the farmers. It was primarily due to adverse weather conditions, limited agricultural technology, and inefficient transportation systems that made it nearly impossible to move surplus food from one region to another to alleviate shortages. If your local crops failed, you were, quite literally, out of luck. Imagine a supermarket shelf that's always empty, and no delivery trucks on the horizon. Now for a quirky tidbit. During severe famines, desperation could drive people to eat truly unusual things. Records suggest instances of people resorting to eating tree bark, grass, or even, in extreme cases, clay or the bodies of the dead. It paints a grim picture of just how far human beings would go to survive. Historians still argue whether the frequency and severity of these famines were exacerbated by the feudal system itself, which often tied peasants to the land and limited their mobility, preventing them from seeking food in less affected areas. Was the social structure itself a silent contributor to starvation, or merely an ineffective buffer against natural disaster? It's a debate that highlights the complex interplay of human systems and environmental realities. The pervasive threat of famine deeply influenced medieval life. It instilled a fundamental caution and a desperate pragmatism. Every harvest was critical, every surplus precious. It reinforced the importance of community solidarity, as neighbors often relied on each other during lean times, even as it could also breed intense competition for meager resources. This constant dance with starvation contributed to the overall brutal texture of the era, a stark reminder that life was cheap and survival a daily battle, not just against human adversaries, but against the very forces of nature itself. The gnawing ache of hunger was a constant, unspoken brutality, shaping decisions, dictating actions, and ultimately shortening countless lives. Following closely on the heels of famine and plague, you encounter another inescapable and deeply unsettling aspect of medieval brutal reality: the pervasive issue of poor hygiene and rampant disease. Imagine for a moment a world without flushing, toilets, without regular access to clean water, and where bathing was, at best, an infrequent luxury for most. The air itself would have been thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, animal waste, overflowing cesspits, and the general effluvia of human habitation. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a breeding ground for illness, a silent, relentless killer that touched every household. It's enough to make you spontaneously break out the hand sanitizer and take a very long, hot shower. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns and cities, even the grandest ones, lacked organized sanitation systems as we understand them. Waste was often simply thrown into the streets, rivers, or open ditches. People lived in close proximity to their animals, sharing spaces and illnesses. Water sources were frequently contaminated by human and animal waste, making clean drinking water a constant challenge. This direct contact with pathogens meant that common infections, which we now shrug off with a quick trip to the doctor, could be deadly. Something as simple as a cut finger could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene and death. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that medieval public baths, while they existed in some larger cities, often became places where diseases could spread rather than be cured, with many people sharing the same bathwater, and hygiene standards being what they were? These communal spaces could inadvertently facilitate the transmission of various ailments. It's like a medieval version of a germ swap meet, where everyone leaves with more than they came with. Historians still argue whether the medieval understanding of miasma, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air hindered or, in a strange way, occasionally helped in preventing disease by encouraging people to avoid foul-smelling, often germ-laden areas. Did avoiding bad air sometimes mean avoiding bad germs, purely by accident? It's a debate that highlights the often intended consequences of even flawed scientific theories. This pervasive lack of sanitation directly fueled the high mortality rates and short life expectancies of the era. Life was a constant battle against invisible enemies. You were perpetually exposed to bacteria, viruses, and parasites, with very little defense. The sheer volume of illness meant that every family likely experienced the death of children, siblings, or parents due to preventable diseases. This constant low-level war against sickness was a fundamental form of brutality, not inflicted by a person or a sword, but by the very environment people inhabited. It was a world where simply existing was a challenge to your physical resilience, and where death, often from unseen microscopic foes, was a constant companion. Given the constant battle against poor hygiene and rampant disease, it's hardly surprising that medieval society also grappled with ineffective medieval medicine. Imagine being seriously ill in an age where scientific understanding of the human body was rudimentary at best, and your doctor, if you were lucky enough to have one, might believe your ailment was caused by an imbalance of humors, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, rather than, say, a bacterial infection. This wasn't about finding cures. It was often about desperate attempts to alleviate symptoms, or worse, to balance what was perceived as an internal disarray, often through methods that sound utterly bizarre to us today. It's like trying to fix a complex computer virus by simply unplugging it and then plugging it back in, hoping for the best, but with significantly more leeches involved. A mainstream historical fact is that medical practices were heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories, particularly those of Hippocrates and Galen, which formed the basis of the four humours theory. Treatments often included bloodletting, draining blood from the patient, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, and herbal remedies. While some herbal concoctions did have medicinal properties, many were ineffective or even harmful. Surgery was incredibly dangerous due to the lack of anesthesia and understanding of sterile technique. A simple appendicitis, which is routine today, would have been a death sentence. Now, for a quirky tidbit, Did you know that one common medieval remedy for various ailments involved applying animal dung? Yes, you heard that right. Poultices made from animal excrement were sometimes used, believed to have healing properties. Perhaps they just added a certain GI nices qua to the patient's already compromised state. Historians still argue whether the psychological power of faith and belief in divine intervention played a more significant role in a patient's recovery than any actual medical treatment. Did patients sometimes get better because they believed they would, or was it simply the body's natural resilience triumphing over both the illness and the cure? It's a debate that touches upon the very nature of healing and belief in a time of limited scientific understanding. This deeply flawed medical knowledge contributed to medieval brutality in a profound, albeit passive, way. Sickness was a terrifying unknown, often attributed to sin, witchcraft, or divine displeasure, rather than germ theory. The inability to effectively treat common ailments meant that illness often led to prolonged suffering, disability, and untimely death. Childbirth was incredibly perilous for both mother and infant. Every ache, every fever, every minor injury carried the potential for grave consequences, instilling a constant sense of vulnerability. This helplessness in the face of disease was a pervasive form of suffering, reminding everyone that life was not just fragile, but incredibly painful when things went wrong, with little hope of true medical relief. Imagine, if you will, peeling back the layers of your daily routine and stripping away everything you take for granted. No electricity, no running water, no climate control, no instant communication, no prepackaged food. This leads us to another fundamental aspect of medieval brutality: life without modern comforts. It wasn't just a slight inconvenience. It was a constant, low-level grind of discomfort and inconvenience that permeated every hour of every day. You weren't simply enduring harsh conditions, you were living in them, constantly. It's like camping, but perpetually, and without the fun s'mores or the knowledge that you can eventually go back to your warm, well-lit home. A mainstream historical fact is that artificial light after sunset was incredibly limited and expensive. Most homes relied on rudimentary oil lamps or candles made of tallow, which flickered dimly, produced a lot of smoke, and were a constant fire hazard. Imagine trying to read, or even just exist, in near total darkness after sundown, with only the dimmest glow to ward off the encroaching night. Heating in winter was equally primitive, often just an open hearth in the center of a hut, filling the small space with smoke while barely warming it. Conversely, summers could be stiflingly hot, with no escape from the oppressive heat. Your clothes were often rough, made of wool or linen, and likely worn day in and day out with infrequent washing. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that many medieval homes, even relatively prosperous ones, didn't have separate bedrooms? Families often slept together in a single room, sometimes even sharing beds, not just for warmth, but for security and space efficiency. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with your entire family, and perhaps a few chickens snoring in unison around you. Historians still argue whether the constant physical discomfort and lack of privacy in medieval life contributed to a heightened sense of community and reliance on one another, or if it simply exacerbated existing tensions and made daily interactions more difficult. Did shared misery create stronger bonds, or just more opportunities for arguments? It's a question about the human capacity to adapt, and perhaps to just get really good at ignoring things. This absence of modern comforts created a pervasive, subtle brutality. Every chore was harder, every task more time-consuming. Keeping clean was a monumental effort. Staying warm or cool was a daily struggle. The lack of reliable light limited activities after dark, essentially cutting short the active day and leaving long hours of enforced idleness or basic domestic tasks in dim conditions. This constant battle against the elements and the limitations of technology meant that life was physically taxing and often uncomfortable. A constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability in the face of nature and rudimentary living conditions. It's a quiet form of suffering, but one that wore down the spirit just as surely as any public whipping. After painting such a vivid, and perhaps a little grim, picture of medieval hardship, it's important to pause and acknowledge a profound truth, a kind of counterpoint to all that heavy reality, the paradox of joy and cruelty. Imagine a world where moments of profound beauty, tender affection, and boisterous celebration existed side by side with the very real threats of famine, disease, and violence we've just explored. Medieval life wasn't a monochromatic canvas of suffering. It was a vibrant, often contradictory tapestry. People experienced genuine happiness, forged deep bonds, and found immense meaning in their lives, even amidst crushing hardship. It's a bit like finding a perfectly ripe, juicy strawberry in the middle of a thorny, overgrown bush, a surprising delight in an otherwise challenging environment. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society, despite its brutalities, had a rich cultural life filled with festivals, religious feast days, storytelling, music, and communal gatherings. These events offered vital opportunities for respite, celebration, and social bonding. Imagine a village fair, complete with acrobats, musicians, and perhaps a puppet show, or a grand harvest festival where the entire community would gather to eat, drink, and dance, releasing the pent-up tension of a year of hard labor. These were not just rare occurrences, they were integral to the rhythm of life, providing essential emotional and social outlets. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that medieval people loved games, many of which are surprisingly similar to what we play today? Dice games, board games like chess and backgammon, and even early forms of ball games were popular pastimes, offering simple joys and a momentary escape from the daily grind. Imagine a knight, fresh from a skirmish, settling down for a quiet game of chess with a monk in the flickering candlelight, a fascinating blend of fierce warrior and contemplative strategist. Historians still argue whether these moments of joy and collective celebration were truly effective in mitigating the psychological toll of hardship, or if they simply served as temporary distractions that ultimately reinforced the existing social order by providing an outlet for discontent. Did merriment make life bearable, or just momentarily forgettable? It's a debate about the human spirit's capacity for resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. This paradox is crucial because it reminds us that medieval people were not merely passive recipients of brutality. They were complex human beings, capable of deep emotion. They loved their families, found solace in their faith, reveled in simple pleasures, and created stunning works of art and architecture. The existence of such vibrant joy alongside profound cruelty highlights the incredible adaptability of the human spirit. It tells us that even in the harshest conditions, the desire for connection, meaning, and moments of simple happiness persists. It's a quiet whisper that even when the world feels overwhelmingly grim, there's always room for a chuckle, a song, or the warmth of human companionship. This understanding prevents us from viewing medieval life through too narrow a lens, allowing us to appreciate its full, complex, and often contradictory tapestry. If the paradox of joy and cruelty fascinates you, then let's turn our attention to one of the most poignant aspects of medieval life that deeply embodies this contrast: childhood's harsh realities. Imagine being born into a world where the odds were stacked against you from your very first breath, where the sweet innocence we associate with childhood was often brutally short-lived, replaced by labor and responsibility at an age we'd consider far too tender. This wasn't a time for endless playdates or elaborate birthday parties. It was a race against time, a struggle for survival from infancy. It's enough to make you hug your imaginary inner child a little tighter. Of MAINSTREAM. Historical fact is the appallingly high infant mortality rate. A significant percentage of children, possibly as many as 1/3 to 1/2, did not survive past their first year of life, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or the perils of childbirth itself. Even if they passed infancy, childhood was brief. By the age of 7, many children, especially among the peasantry, were expected to contribute to the household economy, performing tasks like herding animals, fetching water, or helping in the fields. Imagine your 7-year-old self, not in a classroom, but trudging behind an ox, trying to plant seeds. For noble children, while less physically demanding, their childhoods were often defined by strict education in chivalry or courtly manners, and early arranged marriages. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that medieval children's toys often included miniature versions of adult tools and weapons? Small ploughs, tiny swords, and dolls dressed in peasant or knightly attire were common. This wasn't just for fun. It was part of their early training, preparing them for the adult roles they would soon inhabit. It's like giving a modern kid a scaled-down laptop, but instead of coding, it's for learning how to chop wood without losing a toe. Historians still argue whether medieval parents, facing such high child mortality, practiced a form of emotional detachment as a coping mechanism, or if the deep love we recognize today existed despite the constant threat of loss. Did they love less deeply to protect themselves from pain, or was their love simply expressed differently? It's a debate that forces us to confront our own modern emotional frameworks when looking at the past. This harsh reality of childhood contributed to medieval brutality in a heartbreaking way. The constant presence of death among the youngest members of society meant that grief was a common, if perhaps internalized, experience. Furthermore, forcing children into labor at such a young age robbed them of the extended period of learning, exploration, and sheltered development that we consider essential today. It meant early exposure to the physical dangers and emotional strains of adult life. While there were undoubtedly moments of tender care and parental affection, the overarching picture for medieval children was one of precocious responsibility and vulnerability, a silent form of hardship that shaped the very earliest years of countless lives. Moving from the intimate hardships of childhood, let's cast our gaze towards a colossal institution that exerted immense influence over medieval life, often embodying both immense solace and, at times, considerable rigidity. The Church's dual influence. Imagine a world where the spiritual authority held as much, if not more, sway than any king or knight, where the path to salvation was meticulously prescribed, and where every aspect of your life, from birth to death, was touched by the doctrines and rituals of the Catholic Church. This powerful entity offered profound comfort to a populace living in constant fear, but it also wielded immense power, sometimes contributing to the very harshness we've been exploring. It's like a very strict, but ultimately loving, parent who believes in tough love, sometimes really tough love. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman Catholic Church was the dominant religious and often political force in medieval Western Europe. It provided a universal framework for understanding the world, from the purpose of life to the nature of sin and salvation. Churches and cathedrals were the architectural marvels of their age, physical manifestations of spiritual devotion. For many, the Church offered hope of an afterlife, a respite from earthly suffering, and a sense of community. It also provided essential services like charity, education, what little there was, and a system of moral guidance in a chaotic world. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that the Church often levied its own taxes, called tithes, which were typically 1/10 of a person's income or produce? This wasn't always popular, and sometimes led to resentment, especially when harvests were poor. So, while you were struggling to feed your family, you still owed a portion of your meager yield to the Church, regardless. Historians still argue whether the Church's immense wealth and political power were ultimately a stabilizing force that prevented even greater chaos, or if its rigid doctrines and occasional abuses of power stifled intellectual inquiry and perpetuated social inequalities. Did it hold society together or hold it back? It's a debate that delves into the complex relationship between faith, power, and human progress. This dual influence of the Church contributed to medieval brutality in subtle ways. While offering spiritual solace, its emphasis on original sin and the pervasive fear of eternal damnation could instill profound anxiety. Heresy, any deviation from established doctrine, was often met with brutal persecution, including torture and execution, sanctioned by the Church itself. Think of the Inquisition, which, while more widespread in later centuries, had its roots in medieval efforts to purify belief. Furthermore, the Church's rigid social teachings often reinforced the existing hierarchical structures, implying that one's place in society was divinely ordained, making it harder for the oppressed to challenge their lot without defying God. So, while the Church offered a glimmer of hope in a dark world, its uncompromising authority and willingness to enforce dogma with force added another layer to the complex, often harsh, reality of medieval existence. Just as the Church defined spiritual and moral boundaries, the very framework of medieval society itself was built upon a system designed to maintain order through rigid stratification, feudalism's rigid hierarchy. Imagine living in a vast, interconnected pyramid where your birth determined your entire life's trajectory, from the clothes you wore to the food you ate, and where moving up or down was almost impossible. This wasn't just a social structure. It was a deeply ingrained, almost inescapable reality that inherently reinforced inequality and significantly limited social mobility. It's like being born into a very specific, very unyielding lane on a superhighway, with no exits or on-ramps to other paths. Manstream. Historical fact is that the feudal system was based on a reciprocal relationship between lords and vassals, where land fiefs was granted in exchange for military service and loyalty. At the top was the king, who theoretically owned all the land. Below him were powerful nobles, dukes, counts, who held large tracts of land, followed by knights who held smaller fiefs. At the very bottom were the vast majority, the peasants, or serfs, who were tied to the land they worked, owing labor, rent, and military service to their lord in exchange for protection. This system created a profound disparity in power and resources. Imagine having no say in where you lived or worked, your entire existence dictated by the lord of the manor. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that while serfs were tied to the land, they weren't slaves in the classical sense? They couldn't be bought or sold independently of the land, and they generally had some customary rights, like the right to inherit their tenancy. It wasn't freedom, by any stretch, but it was a distinct legal status. Historians still argue whether the feudal system, despite its inherent inequalities, provided a necessary form of stability and protection in a fragmented and dangerous world, or if it primarily served to perpetuate the power of a small elite at the expense of the vast majority. Did it create order or just entrench oppression? It's a debate about the trade-offs between security and individual liberty in a harsh era. This rigid hierarchy contributed to medieval brutality in several profound ways. Firstly, it legalized and normalized vast disparities in wealth and power, creating an environment where the suffering of the lower classes could be easily dismissed or ignored by those at the top. The peasants, being the base of the pyramid, bore the brunt of taxation, labor, and military conscription, with little to no voice in governance. Secondly, the system inherently limited opportunities for individuals, regardless of talent or ambition. If you were born a serf, you would likely die a serf, trapped by circumstances beyond your control. This lack of agency, the crushing weight of predestined social roles, was a form of psychological brutality, denying individuals the chance to determine their own fate. So, while it brought a degree of order, feudalism's unyielding structure was a fundamental part of the medieval harshness, constantly reminding everyone of their fixed, often low, place in a very unforgiving world. If you thought the legal system was straightforward, think again. Delving even deeper into the peculiarities of medieval justice, we encounter trials by ordeal, divine judgment. Imagine being accused of a crime, and instead of presenting evidence or calling witnesses, your guilt or innocence is determined by whether you can survive plunging your hand into boiling water, carrying a red-hot iron, or being thrown into a lake to see if you float or sink. This wasn't a scene from a fantasy novel. It was a common, terrifying reality where the outcome was believed to be God's direct verdict. It's like a medieval game show, but with significantly higher stakes and absolutely no consolation prizes. A mainstream historical fact is that trials by ordeal were widely practiced across Europe for centuries, particularly for serious crimes where evidence was circumstantial or lacking. The underlying belief was that God would intervene miraculously to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. The ordeal of hot iron involved carrying a heated piece of metal for a certain distance, after which the wound was bandaged and inspected. Days later, if it healed cleanly, you were innocent. The ordeal of cold water meant being bound and thrown into consecrated water. If you sank, you were considered innocent as the pure water would accept you, but if you floated, you were guilty as the water rejected you. You can probably see the immediate problem with that second one. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that despite the apparent barbarity, some historians suggest that priests might have subtly manipulated these ordeals to ensure a desired outcome, perhaps by cooling the iron slightly or choosing a particularly buoyant or non-buoyant accused? It's a whisper of human intervention in what was supposed to be divine. Historians still argue whether the psychological pressure of these ordeals often forced confessions from the accused. Regardless of their actual guilt, or if the sheer terror involved truly did compel the guilty to break down. Was it a genuine search for truth through divine will, or simply a remarkably effective, albeit brutal, form of coercion? It's a debate that forces us to question the blurred lines between justice, faith, and sheer psychological torment in the medieval mind. Reliance on trials by ordeal profoundly contributed to the brutality of the era. Firstly, they inflicted immense physical suffering, often leading to permanent injury or death, even for those eventually deemed innocent. Imagine surviving the ordeal only to be left crippled. Secondly, they represented a terrifying arbitrary element in justice. Your fate wasn't in the hands of rational inquiry, but in a perilous test that could easily go wrong, regardless of your truthfulness. This system instilled a deep fear, not just of human judgment, but of a seemingly unpredictable divine one. It reinforced the idea that life was cheap, and justice, often harsh and incomprehensible, was always just around the corner, waiting to literally burn or drown you. Beyond the confines of the village or the castle walls, another looming threat contributed significantly to the medieval era's pervasive brutality: banditry and highwaymen. Imagine venturing out from the relative safety of your local manor, perhaps on a short journey to the next market town, knowing that every turn in the winding, poorly maintained roads could bring you face to face with desperate outlaws. These weren't just mischievous rogues. They were often starving former soldiers, displaced peasants, or simply opportunistic criminals who made travel and trade perilous, striking fear into the hearts of merchants and ordinary travelers alike. It's like every country road was a potential level in a very dangerous video game, and you were constantly on alert for surprise attacks. A mainstream historical fact is that widespread banditry was a common problem throughout the Middle Ages, particularly during times of warfare, famine, or weak central government. Armies disbanding after a conflict often left large numbers of unemployed armed men with no means of support, making them prime candidates for a life of crime. The dense forests and isolated stretches of road provided perfect cover for ambushes. Imagine a group of ragged, armed men suddenly emerging from the trees, demanding your meager possessions, and perhaps much more. For merchants, losing goods to highwaymen could mean financial ruin. For ordinary folk, it could mean the loss of their life savings, or even their lives. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that some medieval communities would organize their own local militias or watchers to patrol roads and deter bandits, effectively creating their own neighborhood watch, but with swords and pitchforks? These were often ill-equipped and poorly trained, but they represented a desperate effort to create some semblance of safety. It's like relying on your grandpa's old fishing club to defend the village from a biker gang, historians still argue. Whether the prevalence of banditry reflected a fundamental breakdown of law and order, or if it was an inevitable consequence of the vast economic inequalities and lack of social safety nets that forced many into desperate measures. Was it purely criminal intent, or a byproduct of a system that offered no other recourse for survival? It's a debate that delves into the complex motivations behind desperation and lawlessness. This constant threat of banditry contributed to medieval brutality in a very direct way. It meant that travel, even for short distances, was fraught with danger. Economic activity was hampered, as merchants were hesitant to risk their goods, leading to isolated communities and limited access to vital resources. More personally, it fostered a deep sense of insecurity. You could be robbed, injured, or even killed by unseen forces lurking just beyond the edge of cultivation. This pervasive fear of outlaws, coupled with the lack of effective policing, added another layer to the harshness of daily life, making every journey a perilous adventure and reinforcing the idea that outside the immediate safety of your home, the world was a very dangerous place indeed. From the perils of the open road, let's turn our gaze to the grim realities of fixed fortifications and the chilling tactics used to overcome them, siege warfare's atrocities. Imagine being holed up within the walls of a besieged castle or city, the constant threat of starvation gnawing at your belly, the air thick with the stench of disease and desperation, and the incessant pounding of enemy siege engines shaking the very foundations of your refuge. This wasn't a quick battle. It was a drawn-out agony, a war of attrition where human endurance was pushed to its absolute limits, often with horrific outcomes for the defeated. It's like being trapped in a really bad, really long, very smelly elevator, but with the added bonus of giant rocks periodically smashing into the side. AMAINSTREAM. Historical fact is that sieges were a common and brutal form of medieval warfare. Castles and walled cities were formidable defensive structures designed to withstand direct assault. Therefore, besieging armies would often resort to surrounding the stronghold, cutting off its supply lines, and waiting for hunger, thirst, or disease to force surrender. This could take months, even years. While the defenders withered, the attackers would construct massive siege engines like trebuchets and catapults to hurl rocks, fire, and even diseased corpses over the walls, attempting to demoralize and weaken the enemy from within. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that one desperate tactic during sieges involved sapping, where attackers would dig tunnels under the walls to undermine them, literally causing them to collapse? And conversely, defenders would dig counter-tunnels to meet the sappers underground, leading to subterranean hand-to-hand combat in the dark, cramped earth. Imagine trying to fight a war underground with shovels and swords. Historians still argue whether the extreme atrocities committed during the sack of a besieged city, often including widespread slaughter, rape, and pillaging, were an inevitable consequence of prolonged hardship and vengeance, or if they were a calculated terror tactic designed to discourage future resistance. Was it pure chaotic fury or strategic barbarism? It's a grim debate about the depths of human cruelty in the fog of war. The brutality of siege warfare was multifaceted. For the defenders, it meant living under constant threat, with dwindling resources and the gnawing fear of eventual capture. Disease, fueled by poor sanitation and overcrowding, often ravaged both besiegers and besieged. For the attackers, it was a test of patience and endurance, often resulting in heavy casualties if they attempted a direct assault. And for civilians caught within a besieged city, the outcome of a successful breach by the enemy was almost universally catastrophic. This protracted form of conflict brought out the very worst in human behavior, highlighting the desperate measures and ultimate savagery that lay just beneath the surface of medieval life, when survival itself was on the line. Stepping away from the battlements, let's consider journeys of a different kind. Those undertaken not for conquest, but for spiritual devotion. The perils of pilgrimage. Imagine yourself, a medieval devout, setting out from your familiar village, not on a quick trip, but on a months-long, perhaps even years-long, trek to a distant holy site like Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. This wasn't a package tour with air conditioning and reliable GPS. It was an act of profound faith, fraught with dangers, hardships, and a constant reliance on the kindness of strangers, or the lack thereof. It's like going on a very long, very uncomfortable backpacking trip across multiple hostile countries. But instead of cool Instagram photos, you get spiritual merit and maybe a few new scars. Mainstream. Historical fact is that pilgrimages were a hugely significant aspect of medieval religious life. People from all social strata undertook them, seeking spiritual redemption, healing. For illnesses or fulfilling a vow, they would travel on foot, often carrying all their possessions, sleeping rough or relying on hospices and monasteries along the way. The routes were often poorly marked, and the journey itself was a test of faith and endurance. Imagine walking hundreds, even thousands of miles, through unfamiliar territories, facing unpredictable weather and rough terrain. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that pilgrims often wore distinctive badges or symbols indicating their destination? For example, those returning from Santiago de Compostela would wear a scallop shell, and those from Jerusalem might wear a palm frond. These weren't just souvenirs. They were a form of identification, a way to signal your sacred journey to others, and perhaps ward off some of the less pious opportunists. Historians still argue whether the physical suffering and self-deprivation endured during pilgrimages were seen as an intrinsic part of the spiritual experience, allowing for deeper contemplation and penance, or if the hardships were simply an unavoidable consequence of medieval travel. Was the pain part of the point, or just part of the trip? It's a debate that delves into the medieval understanding of suffering as a path to salvation. These perilous journeys contributed to medieval brutality in a more nuanced way. While undertaken voluntarily, they subjected individuals to the full spectrum of the era's harshness. Pilgrims were vulnerable to banditry. Remember those highwaymen? Disease, exposure to the elements, and exploitation. They relied on rudimentary maps, unreliable guides, and the occasional charity of strangers. The sheer physical toll of constant walking, poor food, and inadequate shelter would wear down even the strongest constitution. Many pilgrims never made it to their destination, succumbing to illness or violence along the way, or simply disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape. So, even an act of deep spiritual devotion could not escape the pervasive hardships and often brutal realities of a world that offered very little in the way of comfort or safety for those who dared to wander far from home. Leaving the long, dusty roads of pilgrimage, let's venture into the bustling, yet often restrictive, heart of medieval urban life, the guild life, protection and control. Imagine yourself as a young apprentice, eager to learn a trade, perhaps a baker, a weaver, or a carpenter in a medieval town. You'd quickly discover that your chosen profession wasn't a free-for-all. It was meticulously governed by a powerful organization called a guild. These guilds offered a form of protection, yes, but they also exerted immense control over every aspect of your professional and often personal life, limiting individual freedoms in ways that might seem shockingly restrictive today. It's like joining a very exclusive, very demanding club where the initiation ceremony involves years of unpaid labor and the bylaws are written in stone, not easily changed. A mainstream historical fact is that guilds were prevalent throughout medieval Europe, particularly from the 11th century onwards. They were associations of craftsmen or merchants in a particular trade, formed to regulate their profession, maintain quality standards, protect their members from outside competition, and provide mutual support. They established strict hierarchies. Apprentices learned from masters, then became journeymen, eventually hoping to become masters themselves. Guilds controlled prices, production methods, and even the number of apprentices allowed, ensuring a stable market for their members. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that guilds often had their own elaborate rituals, feast days, and even patron saints? They were as much social and religious organizations as they were economic ones. Imagine a medieval guild meeting, probably involving a fair bit of ale and some very serious discussions about the proper length of a shoelace or the acceptable shade of dyed wool. Historians still argue whether the guild system, despite its restrictive nature, fostered genuine economic stability and high-quality craftsmanship, or if it stifled innovation and created monopolies that limited opportunities for those outside its strictures. Did they protect their members or simply create an exclusive club at the expense of others? It's a debate that touches upon the delicate balance between regulation and economic freedom. This blend of protection and control contributed to medieval brutality in a more subtle, systemic way. While guilds offered a form of social safety net and ensured quality, their rigid rules meant that individual initiative could be stifled. If you wanted to practice a trade, you had to join the guild, conform to its regulations, and abide by its often onerous apprenticeship periods. Those outside the guild system found it incredibly difficult to compete, essentially forcing them into less desirable, often more precarious, forms of labor. It created a rigid economic hierarchy where upward mobility within a trade was slow and highly controlled, and starting your own independent venture was nearly impossible. The lack of economic freedom and the inherent barriers to entry, while not physically violent, represented a structural harshness that limited opportunity and dictated the professional lives of countless individuals. It was a quieter form of control, but no less impactful on one's life. From the tangible regulations of guilds, let's drift into the realm of the unseen. The terrifying forces that haunted the medieval mind, superstition and witchcraft fears. Imagine living in a world where every unexplained misfortune, a blighted crop, a sudden illness, a cow that mysteriously stopped giving milk, could be attributed not to natural causes, but to malevolent magic wielded by a shadowy figure in your very own community. This wasn't just folklore, it was a deeply held belief system that could, and often did, lead to terrifying accusations, public trials, and brutal, often lethal, consequences for the accused. It's like living in a permanent horror movie where your neighbors might suddenly decide you're the monster, and the pitchforks are already sharpened. A mainstream historical fact is that belief in magic, both benevolent and malevolent, was widespread across all social strata in medieval Europe. While witch hunts, as we typically understand them, became more pervasive in the early modern period, the fear of witchcraft and sorcery certainly existed in the Middle Ages. Accusations often arose during times of hardship, such as famine or plague, when people desperately sought scapegoats for their suffering. Those accused, often marginalized women, might be subjected to trials by ordeal, remember those, or torture to extract confessions, even for impossible acts. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that some medieval charms and magical remedies involved extremely bizarre ingredients, like powdered mummy or a broth made from boiled wolves? People desperately sought any means to ward off evil or cure illness, no matter how unappetizing or gruesome the solution. It's like trying to cure a cold with a spoonful of dirt and a whispered chant, but with far more dramatic implications. If it didn't work, historians still argue whether the fear of witchcraft was primarily a tool for social control, used by authorities to suppress dissent and enforce conformity, or if it genuinely reflected a profound societal anxiety about unexplained forces in a pre-scientific world. Was it calculated oppression, or a genuine collective delusion? It's a debate that forces us to confront the terrifying power of fear and credulity. This pervasive fear of superstition and witchcraft contributed immensely to medieval brutality. It created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia, turning neighbor against neighbor. Accusations, often fueled by personal grudges or communal anxieties, could lead to swift and merciless retribution. The accused were rarely given a fair trial by our modern standards, and the methods used to extract confessions were inherently violent. The notion that an unseen evil force could be at play meant that justice often bypassed rational inquiry, in favor of barbaric tests and brutal interrogation. This psychological terror, the constant threat of being branded a witch and facing the wrath of an entire community, was a deeply insidious form of brutality, showcasing how fear, when unchecked, could manifest in chillingly violent ways. Moving from the shadowy fears of witchcraft, let's consider a very tangible, daily struggle that contributed to medieval hardship: food preservation challenges. Imagine living in an era before refrigerators, freezers, or even widely available canning. Every single piece of food you harvested or hunted was on a ticking clock, constantly battling against spoilage, rot, and pests. This wasn't just about wasting a little bit of leftovers. It was a fundamental struggle to stretch meat resources, especially through the lean winter months, and the constant threat of contaminated food causing illness. It's like trying to keep ice cream frozen in the middle of a desert, but your life literally depends on it. And the ice cream is actually just a very large, very perishable ham. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people relied heavily on methods like salting, smoking, drying, and pickling to preserve food. Meat and fish were heavily salted to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth. Vegetables might be brined or dried. Grains, the staple of their diet, needed to be kept dry and safe from rodents and insects. Imagine the intense labor involved in salting an entire hog, or meticulously drying hundreds of pounds of apples, all by hand, knowing that a single mistake could ruin the entire batch. This constant effort was critical for survival, especially after the harvest, to ensure sustenance until the next growing season. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that medieval cooks often used strong spices, not just for flavor, but to mask the taste of food that was on the verge of spoiling? While not always successful in making it safe, it certainly made it more palatable. So, that heavily spiced stew might have been less about culinary flair and more about disguising something that was, well, a little past its prime. Historians still argue whether the common practice of heavily spicing food actually contributed to medieval digestive issues by irritating stomachs, or if the antimicrobial properties of some spices offered a subtle, if unintended, health benefit. In the absence of proper hygiene, was it a gut-wrenching experience or a clever, hidden health hack? It's a debate that adds a layer of unexpected complexity to the medieval palate. This constant battle against spoilage contributed to medieval brutality in a more insidious way. Failed preservation meant wasted food, which in turn meant hunger, particularly in a society already prone to famine. Contaminated or spoiled food could lead to debilitating illnesses, adding to the burden of ineffective medicine. Furthermore, the sheer physical labor and time required for preservation reduced the time available for other essential tasks or even rest. The pervasive anxiety about food going bad, the desperate measures taken to prevent it, and the inevitable losses that still occurred, all added up to a persistent, low-level stress and hardship that shaped daily life. It was a quieter form of brutality, but one that gnawed at the edges of existence, always reminding people of their precarious hold on survival. From the anxieties of the larder, let's consider another profound source of medieval hardship that touches upon nearly every aspect of life. Travel, slow, dangerous, uncomfortable. Imagine needing to visit a relative a mere 50 miles away, or deliver goods to a neighboring town. You wouldn't hop in a car or catch a train. Instead, you'd be looking at days, possibly weeks, of arduous, risky movement over incredibly challenging terrain. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a physical ordeal, fraught with threats that made any journey beyond your immediate village a perilous adventure. It's like setting off on a hike through a dense, unmapped jungle every time you leave your front door, but with more bandits and definitely no snack bars. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval roads were largely remnants of Roman infrastructure, often poorly maintained, or simply dirt tracks carved by centuries of use. They were muddy in the rain, dusty in the dry season, and frequently impassable in winter. Travel was primarily on foot, or perhaps by horseback for the wealthy, and goods were transported by ox cart, which was excruciatingly slow. A journey of 30 miles could easily take a full day or more, depending on the terrain and weather. Imagine walking for hours, your feet aching, your back sore, with little hope of comfortable lodging at the end of the day. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that medieval travelers often relied on prominent landmarks like ancient trees, unique rock formations, or even specific church steeples to navigate, rather than detailed maps? Maps, as we know them, were rare and often inaccurate. So, you were essentially relying on a very ancient, very analog version of Google Maps, hoping you didn't miss your particular mossy rock. Historians still argue whether the extreme difficulty of medieval travel contributed to the insular nature of local communities, limiting cultural exchange and fostering suspicion of outsiders, or if the sheer effort involved made the arrival of new ideas and goods even more impactful when they finally did arrive. Did it create isolation or make connection more precious? It's a debate about how physical barriers shaped intellectual and social horizons. This arduous and risky nature of travel contributed significantly to medieval brutality. The constant exposure to the elements, the physical exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of banditry, remember those highwaymen from Section 20, made every journey a potential life or death gamble. Furthermore, the difficulty of travel limited trade, preventing communities from easily accessing resources or knowledge from afar, exacerbating the impact of local famines or epidemics. It fostered a world of fragmented pockets, where news traveled slowly and support even slower. This physical barrier, a constant reminder of the world's vastness and unforgiving nature, was a subtle yet pervasive form of hardship, dictating the rhythm of life and reinforcing the idea that stability and safety were often found only within the tight confines of one's immediate home and village. As we've traversed the physical and social landscapes of medieval hardship, let's now immerse ourselves fully in the sensory experience of the past, the sounds and smells of a medieval town. Imagine stepping through a time portal, not just seeing, but feeling and smelling the medieval world around you. This wasn't a pristine, idyllic setting. It was a cacophony of jarring noises and a potent mixture of often unpleasant odors that would overwhelm your modern senses. This sensory bombardment was a constant, if often unnoticed, contributor to the era's raw, unvarnished existence. It's like being perpetually stuck in a very crowded, very unhygienic public market, but without the option to just leave and go home. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns were incredibly noisy and remarkably pungent. Imagine the constant clatter of horse hooves and wooden cartwheels on cobbled or dirt streets, the shouts of street vendors hawking their wares, the hammering of blacksmiths, the bleating of livestock kept within city walls, and the distant clang of church bells marking the hours. And the smells. Public sanitation was rudimentary, as we've discussed. Animal waste was common on the streets. Human waste might be thrown from windows, and the stench of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and unwashed bodies would have mingled in the air. Imagine trying to eat your meager meal with the overpowering aroma of rotting refuse just outside your door. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that during the Middle Ages, some people believed that strong, pleasant smells could ward off disease? They would carry posies of fragrant herbs, or wear pomanders, small containers filled with aromatic substances, when venturing into crowded or unhealthy areas. It was their version of wearing a face mask, but with considerably less scientific backing and a much more floral scent. Historians still argue whether the constant sensory overload of medieval life led to a different form of mental resilience, where people simply tuned out the unpleasantness, or if it contributed to higher stress levels and a more agitated general temperament. Did the constant noise and smell make people tougher or just grumpier? It's a debate that forces us to consider how our environment subtly shapes our very perceptions and dispositions. This constant sensory assault, while not a direct act of brutality, was a pervasive form of hardship. Your senses were constantly engaged with the raw, untamed aspects of life. The smells of decay and filth were ever present, a constant reminder of disease and the precariousness of life. The cacophony of sound meant little peace or quiet, making true relaxation difficult. This environmental harshness seeped into the daily experience, creating a backdrop of discomfort and unrefined reality. It reminds us that medieval brutality wasn't just about the grand, dramatic events, but also about the relentless, unseen pressures that wore down the spirit and made simply existing a challenge to all your senses. It was a world that truly made its presence known, whether you wanted it to or not. Despite the cacophony and grime we've just explored, it's vital to acknowledge a contrasting truth, one that adds profound depth to the medieval story: art and architecture, beauty amidst hardship. Imagine that even in a world defined by plague, famine, and brutal justice, people possessed an astonishing capacity to create works of breathtaking beauty and enduring grandeur. This wasn't just about functional buildings. It was about pouring immense resources, skill, and spiritual devotion into structures and objects that transcended the harshness of daily life, aiming for something eternal and sublime. It's like finding a meticulously crafted, delicate porcelain vase, sitting perfectly intact in the middle of a war-torn battlefield, a testament to an unyielding human spirit. A mainstream historical fact is the construction of magnificent cathedrals like Notre Dame, Canterbury, and Cologne, which took centuries to build and required immense communal effort and sophisticated engineering. These towering structures, with their intricate stained glass, soaring arches, and detailed sculptures, were not just places of worship. They were expressions of collective faith, civic pride, and artistic mastery. Imagine hundreds of skilled artisans and laborers working tirelessly, often in dangerous conditions, to create something that would outlive them by generations, all for the glory of God and their community. Now, for a quirky tidbit, did you know that medieval gargoyles, those grotesque stone creatures adorning cathedrals, weren't just decorative? They also served a practical purpose as waterspouts, directing rainwater away from the building's foundations to prevent erosion. So, those terrifying demons were actually medieval drainpipes. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for creating such lavish and labor-intensive art and architecture was genuine spiritual devotion, a display of power and wealth by the church and nobility, or a form of social control to inspire awe and obedience in the populace. Was it true piety or just really fancy propaganda? It's a debate that highlights the complex interplay of faith, art, and power. The existence of such profound beauty amidst pervasive brutality highlights the incredible paradox of the medieval mind. It demonstrates that even in a world where physical survival was a daily struggle, there was still a deep human need for aesthetic expression, spiritual transcendence, and a connection to something larger than oneself. The creation of these enduring works of art and architecture offered a sense of purpose, a collective endeavor that momentarily lifted people above the grime and despair of their immediate circumstances. It was a powerful counterpoint to the ugliness and suffering, a testament to the enduring human capacity to find and create moments of profound grace and splendor, even when the world around them was relentlessly harsh. This quiet beauty whispers across centuries, reminding us that the medieval era was far more than just a saga of survival. It was also a story of extraordinary creation. Having explored the paradox of beauty amidst hardship, let's now reflect on the profound human capacity that allowed medieval people to navigate such a relentlessly challenging world, the enduring spirit of humanity. Imagine living through constant threats of famine, disease, war, and the harsh realities of daily toil, yet still finding reasons to laugh, to love, to celebrate, and to hope. This wasn't a time of simple resignation. It was an era where people continually found ways to cope, to connect, and to endure, often with a resilience that astonishes us today. It's like watching a tiny wildflower push through solid concrete. Against all odds, life finds a way, beautifully and tenaciously. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the short life expectancies and pervasive dangers, medieval communities were often incredibly tight-knit. People relied heavily on family, neighbors, and the local lord or church for support. Mutual aid was not just a kindness, it was a necessity for survival. Imagine a communal barn raising, or villagers coming together to help a family whose crops failed. These acts of solidarity, often informal, were the bedrock of daily life, providing a crucial buffer against the era's harshness. Feasts, pilgrimages, and local celebrations, as we touched on before, were vital outlets for collective joy and social cohesion. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that medieval humor, while sometimes crude by our standards, was very much alive? Jests, riddles, and satirical songs were common, offering a much-needed release from the pressures of daily life. Even in grim circumstances, people found ways to poke fun at authority, at themselves, and at the absurdities of their world. Imagine a peasant making a witty, slightly subversive joke about his lord, perhaps over a pint of ale, carefully just out of earshot of the wrong person. Historians still argue whether the strong religious belief of the era genuinely provided a powerful coping mechanism for suffering, allowing people to accept their hardships as part of a divine plan, or if it sometimes led to fatalism and a lack of agency in improving their earthly conditions. Did faith empower them or pacify them? It's a debate about the complex role of spirituality in human resilience. This enduring human spirit was crucial to surviving medieval brutality. It meant that even when the outside world was cruel, people cultivated inner worlds of hope, love, and connection. They found solace in storytelling, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the simple warmth of a hearth fire, and in the shared experience of community. They celebrated births and mourned deaths with rituals that affirmed their place in the cosmic order. This inherent drive to find meaning, to connect with others, and to maintain a sense of purpose, even in the face of overwhelming odds, is perhaps the most profound counterpoint to the era's harshness. It reminds us that medieval people were not just statistics of suffering, but vibrant, complex individuals whose resilience continues to echo across the centuries, a quiet testament to the unconquerable nature of the human heart. As our journey through the medieval past draws to a close, it's time to consider the profound implications of all we've explored, the legacy shaping our present. Imagine looking back at that brutal, challenging world not just as a distant historical curiosity, but as a crucible that forged many of the foundational elements of the society you inhabit today. The harsh realities of the Middle Ages, for all their grimness, weren't simply isolated events. They were transformative forces that, in often unexpected ways, laid the groundwork for later social, legal, and cultural developments. It's like discovering that the very complicated, sometimes messy, roots of a magnificent oak tree are what allow its branches to reach so high and wide. A mainstream historical fact is that many of our modern legal concepts, like the jury system, or the principle of habeas corpus, the right to be brought before a court, have their distant origins in medieval English law, albeit in much more rudimentary forms. Even the idea of universities, centers of learning and intellectual inquiry, emerged and flourished during this period. The struggles for power between kings and nobles, between church and state, though often brutal, slowly laid the groundwork for more defined political structures and, eventually, the concept of nation-states. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that the medieval practice of wearing distinctive coats of arms, initially for identification in battle, evolved into the complex system of heraldry that still fascinates us today, and laid some of the very earliest groundwork for branding and identity markers? So, your favorite sports team logo might have a very distant, very knightly ancestor. Historians still argue whether the extreme hardships of the Middle Ages, particularly the Black Death, ultimately accelerated social and economic changes that led to the decline of feudalism and the rise of a more labor-empowered populace. Did medieval brutality inadvertently plant the seeds of its own demise, paving the way for the Renaissance and later eras? It's a debate that highlights how even profound suffering can be a catalyst for immense, long-term transformation. This legacy of medieval brutality is etched into our present in subtle ways. The lessons learned from widespread famine influenced later agricultural practices and trade networks. The devastating impact of disease spurred eventual advances in medicine and public health, even if those were centuries away. The relentless pursuit of order, however harsh, contributed to the development of legal systems that, while imperfect, aimed for a more just society. The resilience of the human spirit, honed in an era of constant challenge, reminds us of our own capacity to endure and adapt. As you drift off, consider that the very discomforts and dangers of that distant time forged a path, however winding and blood-stained, towards the comforts and complexities of our modern world. It's a sobering thought, but also a comforting one, knowing that even from the harshest soil, something new can always grow. Asterisk, sweet dreams.